This week we're looking at the global economic development. This is chapter 36, section 2. We have three objectives: discuss effects of technology on the world economy. Number 2 is define global economy. And 3 is describe the environmental impact of global development. So after the Cold War, we have sort of a new type of era. Now we started this year looking at the Industrial Revolution. Now we're looking at the technology revolution. So advances in industry. Technology revolutionizes the world's economy. So progress in science ends up leading to new industries. The major industry that we're discussing is technological advances. One example of this would be the development of plastic. So they are able to develop plastic out of petroleum. And when they perfect the development of plastic, that's able for a lot more materials to be produced at a lower cost while still maintaining a high quality. Another example of this is also how production is being developed in factories. So things like robotic arms are being developed in car factories, making a higher quality car at a faster pace. So no longer do we always need to use humans in factories, but now we're actually using more advancements in technology. Information industries change economies as well. So new technologies reduce the need for factory workers. So at the beginning of this year, we discussed how important people working in factories were. That is now changing. Now we have technology such as robotic arms. They are replacing people's jobs. But there are new jobs that are being created. Most of these jobs are in the technological field, such as anything to do with computers. So what's ending up happening is people are having to have a higher education and go to universities, colleges, in order to sort of fit into these new jobs that are being created with technology. Things like using computers and information, this all enjoys great growth. So here's an example of some of the technology that's developing. So here's a computer from the 80s. Here is a computer from the 90s. This is a computer that I would have used when I was a child. And here we have is the MacBook Air. So as we can see, within the span of 20-25 years, we see the development of technology expanding just by the look of computers. Technology revolutionizes the world economy. So we're starting to see new economies developing. The post-war boom, this is after World War II, benefits many nations because it is shifting economy bases. So what this means is, up until this point, only developed nations, nations that had advanced business infrastructure, which would be our blue countries on the left, they were the ones who had factories and people working in factories developing new technology. The shift is to emerging nations. So if we're thinking that, if we look at this map, we can see US, Canada, most of Europe, they're considered developing nations. South Africa, Australia, Japan, they're now shifting to emerging nations, which is all these green areas, okay? So nations that are in the process of becoming industrialized. So these green areas, they're not saying that these nations are necessarily industrialized yet, but they have cheap and eager workers. So because in the US and Europe, Australia, these developed nations, they demand a certain amount of work ethic by their employees, as well as the rise of unions, it's costing a lot to make products in developed nations. So they're shifting it to countries that have a lot of workers who need to work. So that is when we see Mexico having American factories shifting to Mexico for cheap labor. We also see the Soviet Union, India, and China. Now, China would be the biggest example today. A lot of American factories that started in the US have now shifted to China to make their products. And the reason why, it's cheaper to make. There are people who want to work for a factory, whereas in the US, not many people want to work for a factory. Now, one interesting fact is that Taiwan would have been an emerging nation at this time. And when I grew up as a child, everything was made in Taiwan. So Taiwan would be a part of this idea of emerging nations, where many factories shifted from the US and Canada to Taiwan to make their products. Now today, I would say Taiwan is more of a developed nation. So even now, this is changing. China is still emerging, but it's on its way to being developed. Then we have the emergence of the global economy. This is in the second half of the 1900s. So what a global economy means is that there's no longer a clear line between countries with specific companies and products. Because of a lot of the technology that is developed, such as phones, email, any sort of technological advance, it is easy to interact with people all around the world, and therefore it is easy to exchange goods all over the world. So up until this point, it would be difficult to have products coming from China to the US, but now it is easy with large barge ships able to carry tons of fuel and tons of products. We have people can easily phone people in other countries and communicate. So the global economy is these financial interactions across international borders. If you were to look at a company today, most companies would not be making their products in one country, shipping their products to all over the world. But the company itself might be based in another country. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine owns a company that is based in the US. The products are being made in Vietnam, and they are from New Zealand. So we have 3 countries involved in their company, just like that. This is the idea of multinational corporations, so companies that are based all over the world. So many European, Japanese, US companies, they have spread all over the world. Now, thinking of Taiwan, most of the cars that I see driving up to Kanchao, these are Lexus and Mercedes-Benz. These are European corporations that you can get in Taiwan, okay? This spans across a lot. So there's Shell and Exxon. These are oil companies that are based all over the world. So they have many established offices and manufacturing or stores in many different countries. So another example is Uniqlo is a Japanese company but they have a basing in Taiwan. Now the whole goal of what we call is globalization, which is the same as global economy, is this idea of free trade. So what's happening is the elimination of tariffs between countries. So countries are not going to tax other countries' products as much. And the trade barriers between nations starts to sort of fall. So since 1995, we have the World Trade Organization, and this is overseeing free trade all over the world and where it's expanding. So if we are going to look at multinational corporations, this is sort of a good example of a chart. Now I want you to observe this chart. This is your first question. What are the large multinational corporations? And discuss some of the other links to these corporations. Now, starting in the 1950s, we start to have Europe forming sort of an economic community. Now, the official name of this is called the EU. Now, many of you probably have heard of the EU before. So in 1992, the European Union, they end up accepting most European countries into sort of this trade agreement. And in fact, they all adapt to the same sort of currency. That would be the euro. In other areas of the world, we have US, Mexico, and Canada. They form what is called NAFTA, and it's the same sort of idea. Now, US, Mexico, and Canada all have different currencies, but there's sort of a willingness to trade between these 3 countries. The North American Free Trade Agreement, that's NAFTA, and what that ends up doing is eliminating trade restrictions between these 3 countries. Globalization for and against. Now, there are some people who support globalization because globalization does increase a standard of living. Because there are more products being passed around the world, there are more ideas being passed around the world, that means that people have a better quality of life. But at the opposite end, many people say that developing nations benefit the most from globalizations, whereas poor nations stay poor. That is something that I want you to discuss. Do you think that the idea of globalization is increasing the standard of living for all people, or do you think that globalization is only benefiting developing countries? That's your second question. Now, global development and global economy does end up leading to political impacts, of course. Now, one thing that is very clear in the modern history is energy, and the fact that there are possible energy shortages that will restrict trade. Now, the most popular form of energy since the 1950s is oil. And by 1970s, we had an oil embargo, which has ended up causing a lot of economic problems for developed nations. Now, the oil embargo, if we think of oil around the world, we're thinking mostly of the Middle East at the moment. There is a lot of oil in the Middle East. So about 20 years later, in 1990, we have Iraq. They end up invading Kuwait. Kuwait has vast oil fields, and they're a very small country, but very rich country. When Iraq invades Kuwait, there is sort of a global outrage. And while the UN tries to diplomatically stop this, it doesn't really work. When Iraq invades Kuwait, eventually the whole world is worried that Iraq is going to continue invading the rest of the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia. Therefore, people are worried that Iraq will be in control of most of the world's oil. So in 1991, we have many nations, 39 nations exact, drive Iraq out of Kuwait as sort of a clear way to say you will not be controlling world's oil. This also shows how connected the world is. Impact of global development. So while we've been using oil for decades now, oil has left sort of an impact on our world. This is an environmental impact. So burning oil and coal, it ends up promoting development but damaging the environment. So since the 1950s, the ozone layer, which is our atmosphere, they end up not being able to filter out as many ultraviolet rays. Now, ultraviolet rays are sort of poisonous to the Earth. So there are chemicals called CFCs that damage this ozone layer and also causes things like skin cancer. That is being produced when we burn oil. So many farms are being damaged. We have damaged land. We have endangered wildlife. There's basically what has started happening is the overdevelopment of the world. There's a new push in the last 10 to 15 years for more sustainable growth. So what this is they basically want to replace the use of oil and coal in order to produce more greener ways to help the environment. So this is called sustainable growth. Scientists basically want to reduce the harm that humans have been putting on the environment. One example of this is we have a push towards fighting climate change. So as we have been producing more oil, we're starting to see that the Earth is gradually getting warmer and that the weather is getting more chaotic. So sustainable growth is sort of a push to try and stop climate change.